Hi, everyone. Welcome to What the F is Going On in Latin America and the Caribbean. I'm co-host Terry Madsen, and I'm joined by Alina Duarte. Welcome, Alina.
Well,
And today we're really pleased to have Vijay Prashad join us as our guest. He is author, journalist, political commentator, and executive director of the Tricontinental Institute. We've asked him to join us for this episode to discuss the 2025 BRICS Summit, which was held in Brazil this past week, specifically with the Leadership Summit on July 6 and 7. So maybe let's welcome Vijay talking to us live from Santiago, Chile. and maybe we should open this conversation with some of the key points from the BRICS 2025 declaration. And I guess my initial thoughts are the condemnation of unilateral tariffs, military strikes on Iran, the Ukrainian terrorist strikes on Russia. And what else? Oh, and they mentioned an unconditional ceasefire in Gaza. And that has evolved since last night, I believe. And also, I guess Indonesia has been embraced as a full BRICS member. So maybe those are some of the points we can start with, and how those decisions came about and how they're going to affect the BRICS bloc and the rest of the world.
yeah, firstly, this is, as all big BRICS summits, it's a big fiesta. There's a lot of activities that happen around the BRICS summit, a lot of bilateral meetings that are pretty important. But this summit is also a kind of preview of the COP30, which will take place in Belém in Brazil. And it's a kind of setting up, it's almost like Lula tossed the ball in the air, and at Belém, he's waiting to slap it down. Um, they didn't really want to have this be the big bang, because they're going to come back again. It's a bit weird to have the BRICS summit and then the COP30 just following it in a few months in the same country. It was notable for the absence of Xi Jinping of China. He didn't come. It's the first BRICS summit he's missing since he became the head of state in China, the head of government in China. Vladimir Putin also didn't come, but then again, Brazil is a member of the International Criminal Court, and I kind of agree with him. Why take the chance of going to Brazil and risking arrest? But still, it was a pretty big summit. You've hit some of the core points. I think it's important to underline the reason the BRICS countries are saying that they want to recognize a Palestinian state, the two-state solution, and so on, is they're trying to protect Gaza from annexation, also to annex the West Bank. I mean, you may want to call for a one-state solution, but states can't do that. They have to be somewhere in the vicinity of international law. And here, they're actually fighting to protect this land for the Palestinians. I think it was a correct decision. They condemned the unilateral illegal bombing of Iran. I mean, what was interesting was at the time of the bombing, BRICS has two permanent members of the Security Council. I was actually quite surprised that nobody put a resolution on the table immediately in the Security Council condemning the bombings because they're illegal. But the language in this summit was pretty unequivocal. They called it effectively an illegal bombing of Iran. I think that's important, that's significant. They called again for multilateralism, some sort of rules are necessary in the world order, tend to agree with them. They push back against Trump's tariffs. Okay, here, it's true that these are extremely destabilizing for the world system. That this is not this unilateral way of the United States acting is really the issue, not so much the tariffs. I mean, the US is entitled to tariff anybody. That's a countrywide decision. But the United States also plays an international role in the world economy. So its right to tariff other countries has a destabilizing role, if it just comes suddenly. So I think on balance, the BRICS summit, again, as a preview of COP30, in other words, they didn't put a huge amount of emphasis on it. Politically was just about where you'd expect it to land. It wasn't too radical and it wasn't too weak. It was sort of somewhere where you would expect it to land. I think you can't expect it to be more radical in a way than this. It's a very diverse group of countries. Inclusion of Indonesia very significant. We could talk about that later. The importance that a number of Latin American countries came as observers, including Gabriel Boric at the table from Chile. This is important. It means the flavor of BRICS, as we've been thinking about, is spreading around the hemisphere.
BJ, I would like to start by asking what kind of alliance is regional? Because at first point, we saw just a few, but big countries. It was just an acronym. But now it's a major global alliance. What is it all about? What is BRICS for?
Well, it's interesting because you're right to say, well, it's just an acronym because it starts in 2009. The biggest countries really in the global south coming together effectively to say, listen, we are stuck because we've all designed our economies to export to Europe and the United States. But with the credit crisis of 2007, it became clear that these countries are not reliable importers. So the BRICS group starts with an attempt to build South-South economies, so for Brazil to trade with South Africa or other parts of Africa. And initially it was about creating a kind of modest customs union, easing up visas for these countries. There was talk of a BRICS visa, creating some modest financial institutions and so on. Initially, that was the idea. Now it seems that with the turbulence in the United States and in Europe, with the great turbulence, the crazy idea of spending 5% of GDP on military and so on, some crazy ideas going around. These countries are thinking, well, hey, listen, maybe we need to create our own global institutions. We can't rely on them. These are not reliable partners to build institutions with and through. So then the idea comes, well, maybe we should invite all the oil producing countries. So if in the last BRICS meeting, Brazil hadn't vetoed Venezuela's entry, you would have had all the major oil producers as BRICS members except the United States. I mean, effectively, the BRICS Plus is the OPEC plus countries without the United States. United States, a big energy producer, is not going to be in BRICS. But all the others are Saudi Arabia, Iran, Russia, and Egypt and so on. If you added in Venezuela, which has the largest oil reserves in the world, wow, you've got a huge thing. And therefore, maybe given that we're still decades away from being a post-oil economy, maybe you could create a BRICS currency that is denominated in oil. That oil is the final asset of the BRICS currency. Maybe you could have done that. You could still do that. That's interesting. So what is BRICS? It's a work in progress. It's in motion. As new challenges appear from North America and Europe, the global South has had to deal with that, and BRICS is an instrument, one instrument of others to deal with those challenges.
And I want to ask you something. I believe I heard, and correct me if I'm wrong, you did an interview late last year in China. And I believe part of the discussion was about BRICS and just kind of following up on Alina's question. What is it? How strong is it? And at that time, I believe you framed it more as a mood than a movement. And do you feel that's still true today, that it's a mood among the global South and it's still in its genesis?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. That's Obviously, the BRICS is an institution. It's become a series of meetings, of gatherings, and so on. So that is a real phenomena. There are foreign ministers meetings and economic meetings, and there's the new development bank in Shanghai that's headed by former Brazilian President Dilma Rousseff, and so on. There are real institutions, but what anchors these institutions is not really 100% agreement amongst these countries. I mean, look, India is a country led since 2014, it's a very long time, a right-wing government, far right-wing government. Meanwhile, China is led by the Communist Party of China. You couldn't have two more antithetical political traditions running the two largest countries in BRICS. For a time, Brazil had a far right-wing government. Now it has a right-wing legislature and a center-left president. Again, somewhere in between India and China. Not tallying up with anybody. South Africa has a center-right government, maybe a right of center government, with the addition of the Democratic Alliance in their government. With the African National Congress, the Democratic Alliance is a right-wing political party, which is part of the alliance now, the governmental alliance. So, BRICS has a range of things. There's a monarchy, Saudi Arabia. There's a theocracy, Iran. These are such a range of political formations. But what unites them is a mood. And the mood is that they feel like the United States and Europe has basically been treating them underfoot for a very long time, treating them as secondary countries, taking them for granted. And they would like to exercise their sovereignty. They would like to put their ideas on the table. They would like to drive world affairs. Now, it is interesting that some of them are more or better able to articulate their philosophies than others. I'm biased towards the people of the left. For instance, the Chinese government has a very clear path of what they're doing. They're building up their new quality productive forces. They want to advance their scientific and technological knowledge and so on and so forth. I'm less confident in some of the other projects. In Saudi Arabia, it's called Saudi 2030. This was a plan written by McKinsey, which is an American consulting firm, but it's also about sovereignty of Saudi Arabia, pivoting away from oil, building up its own infrastructure, and so on. But what brings them together isn't a common project. They're not all united on this idea of building new quality productive forces or anything. What brings them together is a mood. And that mood is sovereignty from this attitude that the West has had for a very long time, 300-400 years of you guys are just sort of secondary, take orders from us, okay? They don't want to take orders anymore. I mean, they didn't want to 60-70 years ago when they emerged from colonialism. But, this habit of giving orders continued. And now this is the next big wave of countries saying, wait a minute, stop telling us what to do, and so on.
Continue with this, Vijay. I think it's clear that the world has changed profoundly in recent decades. The US is far from the power it was in the last century. And I would like you to deepen into this that you were saying, what you're reading of this multipolar reconfiguration of the world with alliances that seems like BRICS is just a part of all of these, with its new bank, with the incredible development in China. What's at stake in this new reconfiguration of the world?
Well, actually, a lot is at stake. And that's why we see particularly the United States reacting so strongly to it. So let's go over what's at stake, okay? Firstly, you're right. The Chinese have advanced in science and technology in an amazing fashion. Chinese tech companies are really, putting a lot of pressure on Western tech companies. It's still the case that Western tech companies earn most of the not most, almost all of the intellectual property payments, 92% of intellectual property payments go to the West. That's because, even in Chinese products, there are elements of Western technology still, to which rents have to be paid. But this is changing. And now we see that many of the new technologies are actually being developed in China. This is a serious blow to Western advances. The second thing that's pretty interesting along the same lines is that we are seeing a lot of these countries starting to trade with each other and trading with the West less. You know, they are less oriented. So in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, number one trading partner for most of the countries is China, as it turns out. Yeah, number one. It's actually pretty sad that the number one country for trading in Latin America isn't Brazil or Mexico, because these are the two large economies in Latin America. Brazil, in fact, is still very poorly integrated into Latin America. It continues to trade with China, Europe, United States, and so on. The trading between South America even is very poor, the trade relations. You know, it needs to be developed. Mexico is really embarrassing in the sense that most of its trade is northward. You know, it's a northward oriented country, north south. I mean, that is to say, bilateral trade between the United States and Mexico. Mexico needs to be building its trade relations much more with the rest of Latin America. You know, should, but has not had historically a large trade, and you can see that in the geography of Mexico, that the least developed parts are in the southern part of Mexico. You know, I remember, you go to Chiapas and places like that, the road systems are inadequate. You know, if you were to move by land, there is no good train system that goes from Mexico's industrial north down into the south and therefore into the Central American countries and so on. Infrastructure is just not there. You'd have to ship goods, which is crazy. You know, why can't you build high-speed rail and so on, right down the heart of the isthmus all the way to Panama? You know, but that's not on the thing, because guess what? If you produce something in Mexico, you can sell it for more in Estados Unidos, you know, and not down south. You know, it's all going to the north but the buying power is going to decrease in the north. And one is going to find you'll need the economies of southern countries. So this integration it's a huge belief that, well, look, we have to integrate better with each other and so on. So that's the other big change that's taking place, you know, that these countries are actually starting to integrate their economies with each other. I think that's, you know, hugely important. So one is that you can trade with China all you want, but the other is, are you trading with yourselves? Are you going to integrate your own economies? I mean, Fernando Haddad, who's the finance minister of Brazil, before the last election, wrote a very good piece in Fora de São Paulo, where he laid out the case for South American integration, for Brazil to integrate more with its own economies, you know, in the South, like with Argentina, with Chile, with, you know, everybody, Bolivia and so on. It's just very low. So that these are all very positive, even radical, proposals, because then we can think, let's not just produce raw materials to send to the north, you know, or let's not just produce finished goods to send to the north. Why can't we start trading with each other? I mean, for God's sake, you go into a store in Mexico, do you really need to buy biscuits that are made in the United States? I mean, or in Europe? I mean, do you really need European biscuits? I mean, can't people make their own biscuits or toothpaste, things like that? You know, these are very old questions, by the way. These questions that I'm asking were raised by Octavio Paz in his terrific book, The Labyrinth of Solitude. You know, in 1950, he raised these questions of, do we really need to import basic goods? You know, do we not have the cultural strength to produce things ourselves? It's very interesting that 75 years later, we're back to the same questions.
Well, it exemplifies the failure of this whole neoliberal, neo-colonial model. It's just failed to deliver a quality of life for the majority of people on the planet. And BRICS is the majority of people on the planet. I wonder, you mentioned economic integration and trading, the BRICS nations trading among themselves, and specifically in Latin America. I think it was either the Indonesian president or Malaysia, forgive me, who mentioned on Sunday about trading among BRICS partners. And I think they're doing this in ASEAN and with their own currencies. And it's about 10 or 20% right now, and they're looking to grow that. And is that really about strengthening their economy and trade? Is it focused on de-dollarization? Although that seems kind of slow and off in the future, even though the dollar has been weaponized against so many of the BRICS members. But it was interesting that it was brought up about using their own domestic currencies among themselves to grow trade and strengthen their own currencies.
Yeah, I mean, so this is interesting because there's a couple of things here. One is during this period of neoliberalism, there's been an push by the International Monetary Fund and other international agencies to get countries to export their raw materials, build up some dollar reserves, use the dollar reserves to import goods. That's been kind of the proposal for these countries. Except if you think about it, you should encourage countries not to necessarily import everything. If you can make it, you should make it. That's the first thing. If I was running an economy, I would say, what can we make in the country? If we can grow rice, yeah, let's encourage the growing of rice with some subsidies. Let's encourage the eating of rice in our country rather than the import of pasta, yeah, from abroad, because that's dead foreign exchange, yeah. So let's do that. Secondly, if we have neighboring countries, can we make an agreement with them to trade in our local currencies? We don't need to take my currency, exchange it for dollars, pay dollars to my neighbor, then they also have to exchange their currency for dollars. Why do we need to go through the dollar? If I have the rupee and you have the peso, let's just trade in, or Chilean peso versus the Brazilian real. Let's just trade in reais and pesos. And if there is some imbalance at the end, we'll work that out. Maybe there's like, I owe you 100 million reais, but I have that in Argentinian pesos, which would be, and then I'd pay you in that. So we can work it out. There can be a reconciliation of the unevenness in the trade. But we don't need to exchange all our money into dollars to trade with each other. So the second is local currency. This is not exactly de-dollarization. This is just finding a better way to use your external reserves. And then you save the dollars for the things that you need to buy in dollars. For instance, energy, or perhaps, you need to buy some high-tech equipment. You need to buy patents, things that no local currency will be able to buy. So now you start to actually rationally manage your central bank, your external borrowings, your external payments, and so on. So that's part of the conversation. Also in that conversation is if you have 11, 15, 12 BRICS countries, can you use this local currency idea for regional trade with the BRICS currencies, with the BRICS countries, where you say, Brazil and India trade in rupees and in reais, and if there are imbalances, well, India is also trading with Iran, Brazil is trading with Iran, we can reconcile the imbalance later. Maybe we work towards creating a BRICS chit system that, you have so many BRICS chits and you just trade there. So there's no dollar involved. Now, this means that the dollars are used less in international transactions. That's different from holding reserves or wealth in dollars. You see, most rich people around the world and most governments don't really want to hold their wealth or their sovereign wealth or their personal wealth in currencies that are not going to be what they consider safe. The thing about the dollar, why the dollar is the global currency, is the United States has no capital controls. It doesn't have many requirements on ownership. So that if I'm holding a lot of dollars, I can walk into the United States with my dollars and I can buy a building. Yeah, I can alienate property. I can actually exercise my right to use the dollars to buy things. But if I'm holding, whatever it is, Mexican pesos, I can't come into Mexico and buy land. Mexico doesn't allow it. They don't allow me to come and just buy buildings and what. I have to be a Mexican citizen because they have controls on property and they have controls on capital. So unless another country shows up and delivers itself into the arms of global capital like the United States has done, you can't really substitute for the dollar. But what these countries are talking about is other ways to reconcile trade. It's actually a pretty straightforward and simple thing. If three of us we work in the same office, we decide, look, we'll buy each other lunch. Yeah, we'll take turns buying lunch, and we'll make sure that the lunch for each of us is not more than 10 pesos. Okay, effectively. And then if there is an imbalance at the end of the week, we settle it. Okay, I owe you, both of you guys, 20 pesos each. Let's go out and have a drink, and I'll buy you 20 pesos of drinks, and we're done. Yeah. We don't need to actually give cash to each other. We've worked it out somehow. That's the local currency solution. So there's a lot of talk of this. Also, it's important to understand that there are a number of countries heavily sanctioned by the US. So for them, it's not just a matter of, reconciling trade, it's life or death. So like Iran, Venezuela, and so on, they have to go around the dollar. And so therefore, they've already started creating a post-dollar system. But by the way, they still hold a lot of their wealth in dollars, even Venezuela.
BJ, President Claudia Sheinbaum was questioned these days about Trump's statements about raising tariffs on BRICS members. And she said that she has two proposals. The first is to allocate less than 1% of what is allocated to arms production worldwide, to create a program similar to Sembrando Vida, that it's a Mexican program for reforestation and support for farmers as development cooperation. And the second proposal was to hold an economic development summit for well-being. Because she said economic development, not economic growth, because that's different, she said. This seems to be like an approach, or to be like, I think it was more for the global south, these kind of declarations, but without abandoning the priority it has with the US. And I would like to ask you, how important are Mexico's positions in the region and maybe for the world nowadays?
Well, firstly, I would say that I think what both Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador and Claudia Sheinbaum and what the Morena project have done for Mexico is amazing. I mean, the fourth transformation has a great deal of promise. I always tell people that there really isn't a first and second transformation, because in a way, the fourth transformation is a reincarnation of the third transformation, which is Lazaro Cardenas's program. They want to bring back key elements of that program. They're just going back to Mexican history to say it's not just Cardenas, it goes back further, into the earlier republics and so on. But really, this is the redeeming of Mexico's great period of building its national infrastructure. So that's important by itself. What they're doing is important. Obviously, it's difficult for Mexico to join something like BRICS because it's so entangled with the United States. I mean, imagine if Mexico joins the BRICS, it's already in a free trade agreement with the United States and Canada. This would complicate everything. So I don't actually think, if I was a Mexican leadership, I would not seek to join the BRICS right now. I would start to try to build my national economy, to strengthen it within whatever partnerships I have, and to strengthen trade relations with the rest of Latin America. That's the agenda I would set for trade and development, and I think that's pretty much what they've been doing. So, don't listen to me. The thing about 1% of GDP in arms, that is not possible, because there are countries right now, like Iran, which face actual annihilationist attack, and they need to defend themselves. So Iran needs to build up its military forces. China is under threat from the United States. They need to build up their military capacity. Russia is already in a war. I mean, it is not a legitimate thing to say don't build up your military more than 1%, unless you're so confident. And Mexico, in a way, could be confident because it is, I mean, the United States has already won its war with Mexico. Yeah, that was a long time ago. It is not exactly clear that they'll invade, but I must say, I wouldn't be so sure because this drug conversation that keeps coming up leads me to imagine the United States at any point can violate Mexican sovereignty and say, we're coming in, and they've done it. It's not like they haven't done it, they've done it. But I think that it's easier for Mexico because in this period, it's very unlikely that the US is going to come and aerially bombard Mexico City. It's very unlikely. But Venezuela, it could happen. Cuba, it could happen. So in that sense, I think it's a great idea. 1% of GDP. Let's go for that for countries where it's unlikely they'll be going to war. Let them make an assessment. Chile has already stolen the waterfront from Bolivia. Yeah. I don't think there's another war on the horizon. Yeah. I mean, do you really think Argentina is going to go to war on Malvinas again? I doubt it. Yeah, I doubt it. So why not just go to 1%? Like, what is it to you? But I think there are countries that would say, look, we would like to join this in the future, but we are under actually active threat from the United States, like North Korea. They can't join something like this. So that's the problem. I mean, to be honest with you, I'm for 100% nuclear disarmament. Yeah, 100%. But right now, if I was Iran, I would want a nuclear weapon right now. I would actually want to go nuclear. Even though Iran doesn't have a nuclear weapons program, I would say do it. I would tell my scientists, go do it. Why? Because they look at Libya, gave up its nuclear weapons in 2003, dismantled by 2006, country destroyed 2011. Then they look at North Korea, tested nuclear bomb 2006, nobody dares to touch them. So, I mean, that's the reality in the world. A rational government under active threat would say, I'm going nuclear. I mean, it pains me to say that, but that's a reality. So I think Mexico right now is playing the correct role that it should play. It should not be pushed to do more than it can do. But I also think that those proposals are great. And for the second proposal, I volunteer myself to help organize the economic summit.
Sorry.
You mentioned earlier the IMF and the World Bank. And I wonder if we could spend a few minutes talking about those two institutions juxtaposed to the National Development Bank. And the reason I specifically would like to focus on the IMF and World Bank is because Scott Bessent, the US Secretary of Treasury, I think it was in April, had a significant press conference in which he basically told Washington and New York and London, Wall Street and London, that he was resetting the Bretton Woods institutions. And he was resetting them to focus on energy investment and investing in poorer nations, development, infrastructure projects specifically in poorer nations to alleviate poverty and grow their economies. And that's clearly, him functioning in, that neo-capitalist environment in DC, but also is he resetting these institutions to directly compete against the National Development Bank, which is within BRICS?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, I think quite correct. He's made a good decision to enter into the debate around the future of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. There's been a lot of discussion about quote unquote reform of these institutions. Let's not forget that while the BRICS process has been going on, the major countries of the global south haven't exited the IMF and the World Bank because they are members of these bodies. These are international bodies. China has a seat on the board. It has shares in the IMF. These countries all have a stake in these bodies. So they have been arguing also within these bodies for greater say. They've been arguing for less US domination or US Treasury Department domination of the IMF. And it is true that the Trump people have this idea of go back to your original mission in everything. Let's go back to the original constitution. Let's go back to the original this, original that. There's actually a benefit to that in the IMF. Let's go back to the original mission. I like it. What is the IMF? The IMF is a simple institution. I trade with the two of you. When the music stops, I end up owing Terry money. I don't have any money to owe her. I don't want Terry to come in and start claiming my assets because Terry says you can't pay me, so I'm taking the bookshelf behind you. I don't want that. So I go to the International Monetary Fund. I say, look, I'm a solvent country. It's just that when the music stopped, when my bill came due, I didn't have the money. IMF says, don't worry about it. Take this money. I pay Terry. Okay, I owe the IMF money. 15 minutes later, I get paid for a shipment of books I've sent out. I pay the IMF back. That's all it is. It's a bridge loan. That was the intention of the IMF. It was to solve short-term balance of payments crises. Then the IMF entered the business of saying, oh, okay, you have a balance of payments crisis. You want our help. All right. If you want our help, you have to stop subsidizing education. They started interfering in the sovereignty of countries. So because the Trump people are so big on don't interfere, blah, 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 original mission, if they want to open a debate and discussion on the original mission, I think the countries of the global south would welcome it. I don't think the Trump people have actually thought through what this means if they're going to open, which is what they sometimes do or frequently do, where they haven't really thought through the implications. They just sort of run into something. Okay, let's go. Let's have a debate and discussion about original missions. Let's go back to it. Stop interfering in countries in the third world. Stop telling them what to do and so on. Let's go back to the original mission. I agree. But the problem is they may be coming from a different standpoint, which is that the United States might want to slowly wind down its very large payments into the IMF system. And that's interesting because that means it'll have less of a say in the IMF then. I'm interested to see where this goes. I don't believe that this is entirely about the New Development Bank, because New Development Bank doesn't overlap with the IMF. That overlaps more with the World Bank. And the BRICS contingency reserve arrangement, which actually was to be the IMF overlap, is never really got going. But I think this is a debate inside these institutions where there's been a talk of reform for a long time. And the United States' position on reform is no reform. And I think that this administration has said, well, let's go back to the original. Well, let's go back. I agree. Let's have that discussion.
We're coming to the end. So, Vijay, part of the BRICS, the final BRICS declaration, has to do with ending the genocide in Palestine, but also with reforming the multinational system. Is this possible? Will we see the birth of this new multipolar, multilateral system, or is it enough to include new permanent members from Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean in the UN Security Council, as Lula says? Give us some hope.
Well, look, frankly, it's crazy, right? The United Nations has been going since 1945. There are 15 members of the Security Council, 5 of them permanent. Of the 5 permanent, the United States, France, and the United Kingdom are basically Atlantic powers. And then there's China and Russia. There are no African countries. No African country has a permanent seat, no Latin American country. Okay. The other enormous country in the world, India, doesn't have a permanent seat. No Arab country has a permanent seat. I mean, why do France and the UK have permanent seats? I mean, they should be removed. They're tiny little insignificant countries. Yeah. I would say let's rethink the structure. But it's very hard to ask somebody who owns a house to debate whether they should live there or leave there. Yeah, they're not going to leave something that they're sitting in. And so these countries don't want UN reform. But it is pretty shameful that there's no African, Arab, and Latin American representation as permanent members of the Security. I mean, the obvious thing is Brazil, either Nigeria or South Africa, joining the getting permanent seats, and maybe India as well. These are obvious, but it's just not going to happen easily. And when Lula says, permanent seat, he's talking about Brazil. It's pretty much straightforward. The only other contender is Mexico. And that would be interesting. These are two countries also with very strong foreign service, schools and institutions and so on. I mean, it's for the Latin Americans, I suppose, to decide, and they'd have to arm wrestle this out. But, I don't know. Between Brazil and Mexico, Alina, who would you pick? Wow. Wow.
Mexico.
Wow. Leading questions. Really bad journalist work there. Yeah, leading questions.
We love Mexico. We love
Two and one.
happening here. So what else should we talk about, folks, in our final minutes? Any closing comments that you'd like to make, Vijay or Alina?
I mean, I'll tell you one thing in closing, that in Latin America, I feel that we're on the edge of something new. I would say we've been through the fourth wave of progressivism since the Cuban Revolution. The Cuban Revolution was the first wave in 1959. The second wave was the Nicaraguan Revolution of 1979, and then Grenada and so on. The third was the Chavez movement, which set off in motion a whole bunch of election victories in Latin America. And then the fourth was this one that we're in, where it's sort of a center left period, with Mexico sort of defining the left edge of this period. Yeah. But we are in a moment when I think a lot of that is going to end. I mean, in Chile, the candidate going into the election in November is Janet Jara of the Communist Party. She won the primary of the left. She's going to lead the left against very right-wing people, whether it's Evelyn Matei or Jose Antonio Cast. Cast's father was a fascist, was a Nazi. Matei's father worked in the Pinochet government. He was a general accused of torturing, with chemical stuff and so on, hideous backgrounds. They refused to disavow that past. It's going to be a straightforward election in Chile between the hard right and the left. I think we are going to enter a polarized period in Latin America where the center is going to slowly evaporate and you're going to go from the hard left to the hard right. And I think for a time, the hard right will prevail for a time. But I think the left will find its way. For a time, the hard right in Bolivia and so on, the hard right is going to return. We're all going to look at the Mexicans wistfully as they develop their fourth transition and have like a long period of Morena government. But the rest of of Latin America, I think it's the hard right against the left, and the hard right will prevail for a time. The Bukeleism is going to prevail. So I don't know where this leaves the BRICS in Latin America. It's going to be a mess. If Lula doesn't get another term, you're going to get a hard right government in Brazil. So it's going to be rough going, fellas.
Okay, well, maybe we should leave it there. Any comments or questions? Alina? No?
I'm so happy to have Vijay here, so hope it's not the last time.
It was a great
Definitely
conversation.
not the last time for WTF, whoever named this show. Ridiculous. WTF is going on in Latin. Why can't you just say it? WTF.
Because we
Anyway,
won't
just
be
kidding.
loud on YouTube.
I know.
It is tough
I
because
know.
not everybody,
WTF.
understands.
WTF. What is it in Spanish? What is the WTF in Spanish?
¿Qué carajos?
Yeah. Carajo.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, it depends on the
Okay.
country you ask this question.
Yeah.
That's actually true. Okay. All right.
This is el mexicano.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye,
Thank you to our
beautiful
audience.
people.
Thank you,
Bye-bye,
Jane.
beautiful.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you so much. And thank you to our